Hi everyone, my name is Layla Pachidi-Sander, and I'm a Policy Development Officer in the Housing Secretariat. And I want to welcome you to the first pre-recorded webinar for End of Mortgage that will focus on legislative changes and service agreements. Housing providers such as yourself have been key in the provision of affordable housing and play an important role in working with the city to achieve its vision for housing as set out in the Housing TO 2020 to 2030 Action Plan. I do want to reiterate that this session is being pre-recorded and will be published on the city's Community Housing Partnership Renewal webpage, along with this slide deck. Before we get started with the webinar, I wanted to begin with the land acknowledgement and African ancestral acknowledgement. The City of Toronto acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The city also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I also want to recognize that some people will be viewing this webinar from a different location, so I do encourage everyone to take stock and reflect about the lands you're on in spirit of ongoing reconciliation. I'll proceed with the African ancestral acknowledgement. Though I'm not a person of African descent, I am committed to continually acting in support of and in solidarity with Black communities seeking freedom and reparative justice in light of the history and ongoing legacy of slavery that continues to impact Black communities in Canada. As part of this commitment, I would also like to acknowledge that not all people came to these lands as migrants and settlers. Specifically, I wish to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, in support of the cities of Toronto's ongoing efforts to confront anti-Black racism. I pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. Given that this is being recorded in February, I also want to acknowledge that Black History Month offers us a moment to celebrate the progress we made and to also remind ourselves of the work still ahead. So today's pre-recorded webinar will focus on the basics of end of mortgage and include legislative changes, what are service agreements, the impact of mortgage expiry, opportunities and benefits with service agreements. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and the provincial government supported community housing development during the 1970s through to the 1990s. During this time, each housing project had its own operating agreement, either with EMHC or the provincial government, which outlined project terms, funding arrangements, and provided requirements linked to the housing provider's mortgage. Ontario's devolution story. So in 1999, the federal government transferred the administration of social housing to the provincial government. Subsequently, the provincial government transferred the administration and funding responsibilities of social housing programs to 47 local service managers across Ontario with the passing of the Social Housing Reform Act in 2000. The Social Housing Reform Act outlined the social housing system framework, including the obligations of local service managers across the province, such as the City of Toronto. In 2011, the provincial government enacted the Housing Services Act, which replaced the Social Housing Reform Act with updated requirements for the funding and administration of transferred social housing projects. The formerly provincially funded operating agreements were replaced by an operating framework and funding model set out in the HSA, the Housing Services Act. Until recently, the HSA did not identify what happens to housing projects when mortgages expire, meaning that the service managers would be required to continue funding housing providers under a funding formula that would impact subsidy at mortgage end. So who is affected by end of mortgage? This is not a situation specific to the City of Toronto. Across Ontario, the mortgages of many former provincially funded housing projects are set to end over the next 10 years, and service managers are actively focusing on end of mortgage. In terms of the city's portfolio, it includes 139 designated community housing projects under the Housing Services Act, administering RGI and market, where the total subsidy level is impacted at mortgage end. These housing projects provide over 1,500 units in the city's housing system, with over 9,000 units being rent geared to income and over 6,000 units offering low end of market rents. All of these mortgages are set to expire by 2032. Okay, so in terms of provincial legislation, to address the end of mortgage, the province began to make some announcements on a new framework for community housing. The province released the Community Housing Renewal Strategy in 2019, signaling a change with the goal to build the sector for long-term financial sustainability. The focus of the strategy was to create stability into the community housing system. Key areas of interest for the province were to increase supply and mix of affordable housing, provide improved access to affordable housing, ensure value for money and long-term sustainability. Then in 2020, the province released the Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act, or Bill 184. This act is important because it signaled that the province was going to begin to open up and make changes to the Housing Services Act to address the future of community housing. On March 31st, 2022, the province announced new regulations in the areas of service agreements, service level standards, access and income, and asset limits. The new regulatory framework allows the city to renew existing partnerships by entering into service agreements with community housing providers whose mortgages are expiring. The objective of the framework is for the city and housing providers to build on their existing partnership and create a more modern arrangement. The City of Service Manager is responsible for administering and funding a community housing system. Under an operating framework and funding model set out in the Housing Services Act, the city provides an annual total subsidy for Part 7 housing projects through a complex funding formula consisting of a tax subsidy, RGI subsidy, and operating subsidy. As per the Housing Services Act, the city calculates the annual total subsidy with the benchmark funding formula set out by Ontario Regulation 369-11. One of the main funding components of the operating subsidy are actual mortgage costs. So impact of mortgage expiry. When a housing project's mortgage has been paid off, the mortgage component of the operating subsidy will be set to zero. In certain cases, when the mortgage is set to zero, the total subsidy may be a negative number. A negative number for the total subsidy calculation will mean that $0 subsidy is payable to you. The expiry of mortgages under the Housing Services Act funding formula impacts the overall subsidy dispersed to housing providers. Prior to the regulatory amendments introduced by the provincial government, the city would be required to continue funding housing providers in accordance with the existing Housing Services Act formula, which reduces the annual subsidy provided when mortgages expire. Regulatory amendments allow housing providers and the city an option for a designated housing project to enter into a service agreement at mortgage end to best support financial health. Okay, service agreements. So regulatory amendments now provide you as housing providers and service managers an option for a designated housing project to enter into a service agreement at mortgage expiry. A service agreement would be a housing provider's operating framework, allowing the ability to remain in the community housing system as funded and administered by the city. Once signed, the service agreement replaces the terms and conditions of Part 7 of the Housing Services Act with a new contractual agreement. Service agreements change the relationship between housing providers and the city, moving away from the mandated prescriptive arrangement to a renewed financial model. The new regulations also introduced some requirements for service agreements, while also encouraging a flexible approach between housing providers and the city. Minimum requirements for the service agreement include minimum term length of 10 years, guaranteed provision of funding from the city, ability for additional funding opportunities, a process to manage issues of non-compliance and dispute resolution, number of RGI units, selection rules for RGI units aligning with waitlist rules, baseline reporting, and the development of a joint financial plan. Okay, the joint financial plan. The new regulations also require the creation of a 5-year joint financial plan. And it is to be developed jointly between housing provider boards and the city. And it will outline both the city's and the housing provider's financial responsibilities to ensure housing projects remain affordable, RGI housing continues, and operation and capital repair needs are managed. Joint financial plan will identify your level of RGI subsidy assistance. Financial plan will address how the project revenues will meet expenditures, including projected capital expenditures, in addition to how market rents will be set. In developing the joint financial plan, we may also look at what you can do to support your housing project's financial health. For example, reviewing revenue sources. Once the joint financial plan is developed, it will be the basis of the terms and conditions included in the service agreement and will be reviewed at least every 5 years. Okay, with a service agreement, there's an opportunity for a change to the relationship between you as a housing provider and the city as funder and administrator of the housing system. Goals of the service agreement include addressing outdated and complex rules, creating a more flexible funding model, streamlining operating and reporting requirements, and supporting you as you plan to achieve your strategic goals and, where possible, consider future growth. With the service agreement, you also continue your relationship with the city, receiving support and advice, as well as access to sector programs such as the federal and provincial capital funding dollars and access to the HSC insurance program. Okay. Exit agreements. The city does not intend to enter into exit agreements with Part 7 housing providers. This is to ensure investment in community housing is preserved and to ensure that future affordability is sustained. There's mutual interest and obligation to preserve existing housing and decades of invested public funds. The city is confident that service agreements present a flexible approach to fostering growth and sustainability in the community housing sector. A service agreement is a more flexible approach to achieve long-term housing goals, which may include redevelopment, mergers, acquisitions, and building new affordable housing. If a service agreement or exit agreement is not signed, the obligations under the Housing Service Act remain in effect, and housing providers remain under Part 7 of the HSA. As long as your housing project remains subject to the Housing Services Act, you have an obligation to continue to provide affordable housing, including RGI housing, and following the rules of the HSA. The new service agreement framework is a positive step in the relationship between housing providers and service managers. It's not like the Housing Service Act that was imposed upon you and a one-size-fits-all approach. Service agreements are more flexible. The new service agreement terms will be based on a conversation between housing providers and the city that establish a funding relationship that meets individual operational and capital needs. In order for you to take advantage of this opportunity, however, you need to be prepared to discuss with the city what you see as your future and what you need to make that happen. So after 20 plus years under the Housing Services Act, we're all entering into a new phase for community housing. This represents a significant period of change, but also a fantastic opportunity for housing providers and the city to consider your operations and identify what you would like to see post end of mortgage. For the city, it's also an opportunity for us to develop a new relationship with you, one that is based on mutual interest and goals. So to kick off this work, it's important for boards to understand the rules and requirements at end of mortgage, the regulation changes and what opportunities it may pose for your housing projects, the financial impacts of end of mortgage to your housing projects, both operations-wise and capital, and what supports you need from the city in order to remain viable. As a board and staff, you need to start discussions internally and start thinking about what you envision for the future of your building beyond end of mortgage. Moving forward, you need to think about what will be the financial considerations of your housing projects. What are some of the goals that you want to achieve as you look forward and how the city can help you achieve them? The board must lead and be part of the process of decision making and setting direction for the organization. Boards have defined legal duties and are responsible for the process of decision making and setting direction as mortgages expire. This includes managing change, project problem solving, and developing your plan for the future. As a board, it's important to identify who some of your partners are and can be. City staff, your property management staff, your auditor, sector organizations, such as OMFA and CHFT, and perhaps other housing providers as well, can be great resources through this process. For those that have of you that have a current relationship, consider how you can expand this relationship to build your capacity. If you don't necessarily have a relationship, consider how you might form one through this end of mortgage process. Okay, we're coming to a close to this webinar, and we just wanted to provide a sneak peek of what's to come in the second pre-recorded webinar. So working through a planning process for end of mortgage will be key to embarking on a renewed relationship with the city. So to support the planning process, the city's developed an end of mortgage roadmap with suggested key phases and steps in the planning process and beyond. There are 6 phases, inclusive of 8 key steps that you may want to consider, and you may have to move back and forth between steps as you move through your thinking. It doesn't have to all be forward motion. These 8 steps in the end of mortgage roadmap include gathering information, assessing your current situation, knowing your financial situation, understanding your capital needs, assessing your financial outlook, reviewing and discussing with staff and board, entering into negotiations, and finally maintaining a new relationship with the city. I want to note that the next pre-recorded webinar in this series will talk about each of these phases and steps to help you move towards readiness to enter into a service agreement. Okay, that brings us to the end of the slide deck. Thank you for listening today. If you have any further questions about this pre-recorded webinar, please email hss@toronto.ca. Alternatively, you can connect with your housing consultant who can triage your requests and questions. Thanks so much. Bye.